Scott Atran recently wrote an article that was addressing the idea of religion and how it divides, how when you're within the group there's cohesion, but if you have like intergroup interaction, that there's conflict. And there was an actual scientific article that studied various things that have happened over time, the Iranians, who regard Iran's nuclear program as sacred, more violently oppose sacrificing its nuclear program for conflict resolution because it holds it sacred. And so the idea of the entire article is, when you're within your group, if you have the group, so say like if you're a Catholic group, then everyone works together really, really nicely and everyone gets along, and there's a lot of give and take from within the group and different parties within the group. But then when you have Catholic Muslim scenario or the Christian Muslim scenario, then you have a lot of conflict. And this is that idea where we've talked about with religions where we say we want them to all come together and we want everyone to be,
they kind of can't because they're all
mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Well, this article discusses that that's because of things that they end up putting on that pedestal of sanctified, and holding that as holy, and then all arguments go out the window. Like, because once you have something that becomes unflexible, and this is where I think there's the big issue with religion, is that we have imaginary ideals that are setting hard and fast rules that are unbreaking, like the William Lane Craig thing, that morals are objective, and they're not. There's cultural aspects to bring into play, and especially when you're talking intergroup interaction. Other examples of this that they were discussing was like Indonesian students in foreign madrasas that regarded the Sharia law as sacred, and so then they were more violently opposed to compromising that in any sort of way, and thus turned away significant economic aid or significant political aid because they're not willing to allow some changes to the Sharia law. And so rather than even having that discussion, though, they shut the wall off, because...
But it makes sense. If you really think that this is ordained by God to be the way that it is, why would you compromise anything?
And it makes sense. Go ahead, actually.
Oh, I was just going to say, they just did a video on this on Bill Maher, Nancy Pelosi's daughter, who the people said, I won't vote for my own self-interest, I'm going to vote for God.
Right. People who put it above everything.
Yeah.
But if you really think that way, why wouldn't you?
Yeah. And it makes sense, but that's what's kind of interesting about the article, is it kind of points out the obvious. But it goes to so many of the things that we've been discussing, recently, even today, is just this idea of that, like, if you are this fundamentalist who believes that it's absolutely the word of God, you're actually being the most honest.
Right.
But you're also the most dangerous because you're completely unflexible in working with, others around you. I mean, one of the interesting lines was that this dynamic is behind the paradoxical reality that the world finds itself in today. Modern multiculturalism and global exposure to multifarious values is increasingly challenged by fundamentalist movements to revive primary groups' loyalties through greater ritual commitments to ideological purity. And that's why you see like this kind of death rattle from the fundamentalists, where they're coming out and they're, the hand wringing has just gotten out of control. Stuff
like the Pope declaring that he'd rather have a smaller, more insular church that was more devout than a larger one.
Exactly. I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, I want to say kudos to them because they are holding their sacred values to be true, and that's good. But then you look at the fact that it has no basis in reality, it has no evidence to back it up, and they're making these hard-lined, horrible decisions to be like, no, we'd rather have our people starve to death than accept help from you because you don't agree with our Sharia law, or any other thing that they've decided to hold sacred. And then so they suffer for what? For literally imaginary ideas, for things that they cannot prove exist, things that they cannot explain to anyone else, like with hard evidence to say this is why you should think that way.
Right.
And then they suffer these horrible consequences because of that. Exactly.
And I would be curious to see in their religion what it says about allowing people to starve. In refusing this help, are they contradicting themselves? In staying fundamental to this idea, are you contradicting yourself in another idea? And I bet in a lot of situations they really are.
That's actually an excellent point too. I think I've seen in the Quran, from what I've seen, that it's actually not the case there. That it's more specific. You are better to suffer than to compromise your ideals.
Yeah.
But I think there's a little bit. I mean, I think the Bible is a little more contradictory. Contradicting itself per se.
Well, yeah.
So that leaves more room for that. But I think you see that a lot more in the Bible, where it would be better to like accept the charity and help your people, and maybe give in on certain things. But I'm not positive about that.
So I'm not. I'm pretty sure, in fact, that the opposite is true.
Okay.
So
lately, I feel like I've read more Quran than Bible, so
I think I have.
Seems to be a constant topic of discussion
lately. So I don't know. It's a sad state, and it's exactly like we just saw in this other article about teaching that Islam is the enemy and things like that. Because, and I said in there that it's almost kind of true, because of the fact that if you get those Islamic people that are not willing to have like that rational discussion and aren't willing to make reasonable sacrifices to things that they hold sacred to get other benefits that to help bring their country along, how are we supposed to get along? How are we supposed to come together?
I don't know that we can. I mean, it's the problem of religions are divisive. They put people into groups, and when you have all these groups that hold these things sacred for a reason, that Jesus is the Son of God, and the only way to get to heaven is to believe that and accept Him. And anything short of that sends you to hell. But then you have, Islam that says, Muhammad is the final prophet with the final revelation, and if you believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ, then you are going to the Muslim hell, and that's unbreakable. That's a conflict that these two sides are never really going to rectify. I mean, and in fact, I shouldn't say, because maybe they will, because some Christians step to that line where they, or maybe they don't really even count as Christians anymore, even in their own minds, where they say, all religions are a path to God, and it doesn't matter what path you take. But that's the only way to get to that point is to eschew the texts, is to take all the sacred writings where all these beliefs come from,
right,
or are taught from, where it all stems out of, is to take that and ignore it.
Yep.
That's the only way to get to that point. When we talked about the Easter Sunday in a mosque story, where that wasn't like a fulfillment of faith, it was like a suspension of religious belief,
right,
that got people to cooperate. And that's the only place that it comes from, because without the suspension of the sacred, as it were, groups can't get along because of the mutually exclusive nature.
Right.
That's just how it is. Religion divides people. It brings people together as long as they're in that insular group. But then moving outside that group, it compartmentalizes them, and it says, we're us and they're them, and we may get along on a surface level, but we are fundamentally different.
Right.
And our afterlives are going to be fundamentally different, and we're the good people, and they're the bad people. We just get along with them so that we can have a civil society.
Right.
I feel that tension all the time when I deal with Christians, because they have this idea of me that I am rejecting their God, which I do, and there's going to be a very specific punishment for me in the afterlife. And there's not anything that I do, any good action I take, any one that I'm nice to, is just, I might be nice for doing it, but I'm missing something fundamental about existence that I'm going to pay for later.
Well, and before you even became an atheist, we've all dealt with that interaction in this state, particularly just by simply being non-LDS. Didn't matter what you were.
Sure.
It was us versus them. And, you have this very intertwined, very supportive group of one another if you're part of the LDS church. And if you aren't, it didn't matter what you did unless you were willing to join the church here.
I think I just find the fact that the things that they choose to hold sacred, and I don't know if that thought process of like those things that they've put on the pedestal, I don't know if they really reflect back on why it's there and see the gaps, and see like, why am I holding this sacred? Like, why is this the most important thing in my life, but I can't even prove that he exists? Like I don't understand how they can do, because that's where I guess my point of the whole article is the fact that you basically have faith making the biggest decisions of not just yourself, but like your country and how it affects your people and your future in this planet. I mean, just so weird to me that faith alone can drive that to the level of rigidity that it has, where it's just they're unbending, and it's this imaginary thing. It's this thing that they cannot take one person off the street and be like, hey, see, this is my God, this is what it looks like.
Right.
There you go. Have a nice day. Now you know about it. They can't do that because there's just no evidence whatsoever. But yet they'll make the hardest line decision that they can based on that. That's the part that I find interesting.
No, you're right. It doesn't make sense. The idea that you base your possibly socioeconomic status, your happiness in life and everything else on a feeling is the hardest thing I think we've all tried to get a grasp on.
Yeah, get an understanding of.
And you've begged people, via comments and everything else, explain to me how a feeling, is so much more important to you than being able to eat at night.
Yeah.
Being able to clothe your children, being able to, live under a roof.
And this is actually, I think, this is a great example of, which I've talked about before. People have this feeling like this thing is sacred and we can't violate it. It doesn't matter what consequence comes to our country. We can't accept food aid or something like that because that would somehow violate some religious principle. We can't accept help from these people because they're not the religion that we are. And that has a really direct consequence. But when you take it outside the scope of religion and you say, okay, if you had these feelings about some kind of medical procedure based on no religious attitude, like, everybody would think you were crazy.
Yep.
Like, if they were refusing food aid because the country giving food aid doesn't practice like a chiropractic only medical philosophy, that would be ridiculous.
Exactly.
But you put it in the context of religion and it suddenly makes sense.
Exactly. That's a great
When
point.
it's just like this totally, I can't prove anything about it, it's just a feeling that I have. But in the context of religion, it totally makes sense.
Yeah. That's why I wanted to bring it up. Is why do you base your hardest decisions off of feeling? That's an excellent way of analyzing it. And let us know what you think in the comments. Outcasts out.